Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. The hydrophone network I worked for had started its existence as something else entirely, which is a detail that matters more than it might seem to at first. It had been built decades earlier as a military system, an array of underwater listening stations distributed across multiple ocean basins, designed during a period when the primary concern was tracking submarine movement across the deep Pacific and Atlantic. When the original strategic purpose diminished, the system was declassified in stages and eventually repurposed for civilian oceanographic and marine biology research. The same physical infrastructure now serving scientists who wanted to listen to whale populations and seismic activity and the general acoustic life of the deep ocean rather than military assets. The result was a listening network with a sensitivity and a geographic coverage that no purpose-built civilian system could have matched, an inheritance from a different era's priorities, now doing quieter, more curious work. I had been processing data from the network for 6 years by the time the signal appeared, working from a research consortium office that handled the civilian side analysis for a section of the array covering a large stretch of the central and eastern Pacific. The job involved daily review of the acoustic data streaming in from dozens of hydrophone stations, identifying and cataloging the sources of everything the array picked up. The deep ocean is loud in ways that surface observers don't expect. Whale calls traveling enormous distances through the deep sound channel, the grinding and popping of tectonic activity, the mechanical hum of shipping traffic, the occasional unexplained transient that gets logged and usually never resolved into anything more specific than unidentified low-frequency event. Most days were routine cataloging. The deep ocean has a vocabulary, and after 6 years, I knew most of it. The signal first appeared on a single station in the eastern Pacific, a hydrophone positioned along a stretch of deep ocean floor, a considerable distance from any major shipping lane or known seismic feature. It registered as a low-frequency pulse, faint, well below the threshold that would normally have triggered active investigation, the kind of marginal detection that the automated cataloging system flagged as a probable sensor artifact, and that I would normally have reviewed briefly and dismissed. I almost did dismiss it. The frequency profile had a quality that made me pause before closing the file, a regularity to the pulse that artifacts didn't usually have, evenly spaced and consistent in amplitude across the several minutes of detection. I logged it as unresolved rather than dismissing it outright and moved on with the rest of the day's data. It came back the following day. Same station, same low-frequency profile, the same evenly spaced pulse pattern, present for a comparable duration before fading below the detection threshold again. 2 consecutive days of the same signal from the same station was enough to move it out of the probable artifact category and into something that warranted a closer look. And I pulled the historical data from that station going back several months to check whether the signal had been present previously and simply hadn't registered above whatever threshold I'd set for review. It hadn't been there before. This was new. On the 3rd day, it appeared on an adjacent station, roughly 40 miles from the original detection point, with the same acoustic signature. I want to explain why that mattered, because a signal appearing on a different station isn't automatically significant. Multiple stations across a wide area regularly detect the same large-scale event, a major seismic disturbance, or a sufficiently loud whale call traveling through the deep sound channel can register on several stations simultaneously. What made the second detection significant was the timing. It wasn't simultaneous. The signal appeared on the adjacent station roughly 6 hours after the original station's detection had faded, the kind of delay that doesn't happen when a single event is being heard by multiple stationary listeners. It happens when something is moving, the source itself relocating from a position closer to the first station to a position closer to the second. Something was moving through the water, slowly, producing a low-frequency pulse as it went, and the array had just started hearing it. I began tracking it systematically after that, pulling the data from the full regional station array each day and checking for the signature, building a position estimate from whichever stations were registering it, and triangulating where possible when multiple stations picked it up close enough together to allow it. Over the following weeks, the picture built incrementally, each day's data adding another point to a track that was forming with a clarity I hadn't expected from such a faint and intermittent signal. The acoustic signature. Once I had enough clean detections to run a proper frequency analysis, told me something about scale that I sat with for a long time before I was willing to commit to it in my notes. Low-frequency sound in water carries information about the size of its source in a relationship that acoustic science understands reasonably well. Larger sources producing lower frequencies and greater amplitude at the point of generation, even when what eventually reaches a distant hydrophone has been attenuated by distance. I ran the signal's characteristics against everything in the marine acoustic library, every known whale species, every documented marine animal vocalization, and the closest match in terms of frequency profile was the blue whale, the largest animal on Earth, whose deep calls are themselves a marvel of low-frequency biological sound production. The signal I was tracking implied a source significantly larger than that, not marginally larger. The frequency and amplitude relationship, extrapolated using the same models that worked reliably for known whale vocalizations, suggested a source whose scale didn't correspond to anything in the existing record of marine life. An animal or an object considerably larger than the largest documented creature in the ocean's history. I brought this to my supervisor, a marine acoustician named Farrow, who had been with the consortium for nearly 20 years and who approached unusual findings with the patient skepticism of someone who had seen plenty of promising anomalies resolve into mundane explanations. He reviewed my tracking data and the frequency analysis carefully over several days, running his own parallel calculations, and came back to me with the same conclusion I had reached, delivered with considerably more caution in how he phrased it. He said the data was internally consistent and the methodology was sound, and that if the size extrapolation was accurate, we were tracking something whose scale didn't fit any existing biological or geological explanation he was comfortable putting forward. He authorized continued tracking and asked me to keep the broader findings within our immediate team until we had more data. I tracked it for the better part of 4 months. The path it traced across that period, once I had enough position estimates to plot a coherent route, was the detail that unsettled me more than the size estimate had. Marine animals, even large migratory species, move in patterns that reflect biological needs, following food sources or temperature gradients or breeding cycles, producing tracks that wander and adjust and respond to the ocean's variable conditions. What I was plotting wasn't that. It was a heading, a straight, deliberate line across the deep Pacific, adjusting only for major undersea terrain features that would have been physically obstructive, otherwise holding a consistent direction with a precision that didn't read as foraging or wandering or any pattern I associated with biological movement through an environment. It was going somewhere. I extended the heading forward using the consistent direction it had held across the tracked period, plotting where the course would lead if it continued unchanged, and the projected path ran toward a heavily trafficked section of the eastern Pacific, shipping lanes and coastal approaches that saw regular commercial and naval vessel traffic. I brought the projected heading to Faro and watched him go quiet in the specific way that had become familiar to me. Over the previous months, the quiet of someone absorbing information that their professional framework didn't have a comfortable place for. He authorized expanded monitoring along the projected route, requesting additional station data from the network's broader infrastructure beyond our immediate regional coverage. And for the following several weeks, I tracked the signal as it moved into water that brought it progressively closer to the busier eastern approaches. The acoustic signature changed as it moved into shallower water. This was the development that I've spent the most time thinking about since, because it was the point at which the signal stopped being simply large and started being something with internal structure, additional frequency components emerging in the detections that hadn't been present in the deep water signal. A complexity to the pulse pattern that suggested either a change in the source's behavior or a change in how its sound was propagating through the different water conditions of the shallower approach. A hydrophone station positioned directly along the projected path, one of the network's older installations that had been scheduled for eventual replacement but was still operational, recorded what turned out to be the closest detection of the entire tracking period. The recording shows the signal's amplitude increasing steadily over several hours, consistent with something approaching the station's position, the low-frequency pulse growing stronger and the additional structure in the signature becoming more pronounced as the distance closed. And then, in the final minutes of usable data before the station's transmission failed entirely, the recording shows a saturation event, the signal's amplitude exceeding the sensor's recording range entirely, the waveform flattening into the kind of overload distortion that happens when a sound source is too loud or too close for the equipment to capture accurately. The station went offline immediately after, not a gradual degradation, not the kind of signal loss that equipment failure typically produces. A complete and immediate transmission cutoff, the station's data feed simply ending, no further transmissions of any kind in the days and weeks that followed, despite the consortium's maintenance team confirming the physical equipment was intact and the connecting infrastructure showed no damage. The signal didn't reappear on any subsequent station along the projected route. I want to be honest that I don't know what happened in that final approach, whether the saturation event represents the source passing extremely close to the hydrophone or doing something to it directly, or whether the station's failure is a coincidence unrelated to the tracked signal's approach. I've gone back through the data more times than I can count, and I don't have an answer that I'm fully confident in. The consortium's oversight body reviewed the full tracking record after the station failure and classified the event, restricting further public release of the acoustic data from that period and from that section of the network. The official explanation, documented in the consortium's internal records, attributed the anomalous signal and the subsequent station failure to equipment malfunction in an aging section of the array, a conclusion that the technical team's own assessment of the physical hardware didn't fully support, but that became the standing position, regardless. I kept my own archive of the tracking data, the daily detections and the position calculations and the frequency analyses, built up across 4 months of careful work that I wasn't willing to simply let disappear into an internal classification decision. The archive survives, complete and unaltered, on a drive that has nothing to do with the consortium's systems. The hydrophone station that went offline was never reactivated. The consortium's subsequent infrastructure planning quietly removed it from the active array rather than scheduling the replacement that had originally been planned, and the section of ocean floor it had covered has gone unmonitored since. I left the consortium about a year after the tracking period ended for reasons that had more to do with this experience than with anything I said in my resignation. I think about the 4 months of data more than I'd like to, the slow, patient, unhurried movement of something whose scale didn't fit anything we had a category for, holding a deliberate course across an enormous distance with the kind of consistency that nothing in the natural behavioral record of marine life produces. The ocean is large enough and deep enough that the vast majority of it has never been listened to with instruments sensitive enough to hear what's actually moving through it. The hydrophone network I worked for was, despite its impressive scale, still only a partial covering of an enormous 3-dimensional space. Gaps between stations large enough that something moving carefully could likely pass through significant stretches of ocean without triggering a single detection. Whatever I tracked for those 4 months had been making some version of that same journey, I have to assume, for far longer than 4 months, far longer than the hydrophone network has existed, far longer, probably, than human seafaring has existed in any form capable of noticing it. The only thing that changed, the only reason any of this came to my attention at all, is that for the first time in however long this pattern has been repeating, something happened to be listening. I don't know if it noticed that. I don't know if the saturation event that took out that final station was incidental or intentional, a passing disturbance or a deliberate response to being heard. I just know the ocean is very large and very old, and that we have only recently developed the means to listen to small parts of it carefully. And in the brief window we've had that capability, we heard something that has apparently been moving through it, unhurried and unnoticed, for a span of time I don't have any way to estimate. It's still out there. We just aren't listening to that station anymore.